Hello and welcome to the Toledo Museum of Art, Sculpture and Blacksmithing Studio. My name is Hans Rubel, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to make a steel vessel. I certainly didn't invent steel vessels, but this variation of a steel vessel I came up with about a decade ago, and they're really fun to make. I've taught dozens and dozens of workshops on how to make them, and they're just lots of fun. I like to put each one, I like to make a little different. I like to put different textures on them. So you can see on the inside, I'll show you some later on that are cleaned up, that have patinas and sealers that will make it a little bit easier to see. But each one I like to put a little different texture on, which helps make them unique. And the bottom of the vessel has a steel foot, which is actually a piece of steel pipe that I forged. What we're going to, I'm going to set this aside. What we're going to start with today is the sheet, well, the materials. So I've got steel pipe. I'll talk about that later. And then I've got sheet metal. This is 18 gauge. This is a 7-inch piece of 18 gauge sheet metal, mild steel. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to put that in the forge. And then I'm going to, while it heats up, let's just show you the hammer I'm going to use. This is the hammer I used in that sample piece I just showed you. I took an inexpensive hammer. You can see it's seen better days, but it's just a real cheap hammer, and I cut a design into the hammer, a checkered kind of design. So every time I strike or hit the steel, it'll transfer. I buy them, but they're so easy and fun to make. I like to make my own. So it will probably take 2 to 3 heatings or heats to get the whole piece textured. I'm going to go ahead and start. I think I've just come up to temp where I can go ahead and start. So I want a good orange color like this. So normally I would probably have stopped and not hammered the metal at that black color, but this particular steel I'm using is very soft, and I knew I could get away with hammering it a little bit at that black heat color or when it's not glowing, and it wouldn't hurt the steel. So I was actually able to texture about half of the steel. Now, these tongs, by the way, are actually, I made these as a demo for a class. Teach blacksmithing classes here if you're interested. And the traditional thing we often do when I teach blacksmithing is to help learn different forging techniques, and rivet making is have students make a pair of tongs. So this happens to be a pair that I made by hand. It just turns out it's a perfect shape for holding this sheet metal. So let's go ahead and try to texture the other half. So I like a fairly consistent texture, but I don't want to overdo it. I'm looking closely at the metal. If I see a blank spot, I'll give it an extra tap or two, and we're good. Okay, so now you can see a lot of flakes popped off of this steel. I wipe that off the anvil. That's iron oxide, basically. That's fire scale. We call that fire scale. It's a layer of burned steel, normally forms on the surface. You know, one thing that's kind of interesting is in my sample, this is just wire brushed. I didn't put any sealer or anything on it, wax or anything, just how it looks after I've done assembling. You notice it has some reddish colors in it. What happens is part of the combustion, since I'm using a gas forge, is part of the byproduct is not only carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, but it's also water vapor. So that water vapor gives you little rust highlights often on steel. That's natural. I did not quench this in water, so that was just from the forge itself. Okay, so next I'm going to switch to this tool over here. It's called a Swage Block. It's actually a small Swage Block on top of a large one. The small one has a nice depression in it, and I'm going to use that depression to shape this piece. I'm going to go over here, and I'm using a rounding hammer, so it's like it sounds. It's round, and a considerable amount of fire scale is going to pop off. If I let the steel wrinkle, as you can see it is doing, I think it has a nicer organic look. I just like the way that looks. So I like to let the wrinkles develop, and often, and I might do that, if I don't see a wrinkle where I want one, I'll purposely put a wrinkle in the steel to make it look a little more interesting. I constantly am quenching my tongs so they don't get too hot, and also wiping the fire scale off my tools so that fire scale doesn't get beaten into the steel. When working with steel as thin as I am, the sheet metal, I have found, although you can heat the steel over and over, remember a little bit's burning off every time. That layer that I was talking about and falls off. So if I heat it too many times, it can literally become paper thin when it's real thin steel like this. So a little bit more here, then I'm going to the anvil right next to it. Maybe this, it's okay. The shorter handle I think would be more comfortable at this point. So this tool, Pipe Jig, is just a piece of pipe that allows me to get a deeper form. It is bottoming out on that round swage, so this becomes quite helpful at this point. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now I'm well on my way. I've got to getting the depth that I wanted in this piece. So, really nice if you could see the inside. This is just a round pipe with a little support I welded on so it fits in the hole of the anvil, the hardy hole. I can now shape all kinds of things in there if I need a more depth, more dimension. It's very useful for that. I have a number of jigs based on that very simple concept. Now what I'm doing with this tool is, even with the long tongs, I found it was a little hard to pull out that hot steel because this forge throws off a considerable amount of heat. So I use the fire tool to pull the steel closer, and then I can grab my steel. When working on thicker and larger vessels, often I have to wear a jacket, a welding jacket, to protect myself from the heat, because so much heat comes off from that forge. And the steel itself, a lot of radiant heat. Sometimes the radiant heat or the heat just coming off the steel itself has burned my arms. So I've learned, you know, it's not that hard to just put a welding jacket on, and then it protects you from that heat. Okay, so I'm stopping and really looking at the shape. I know it's a little cool, but I can safely still give it a few more taps. I'm going to try to get it a little more even, and then there's one side where the wrinkle is not pronounced as I would like it to be. So I actually am going to try to purposely wrinkle that. The steel is this thin, it really heats up real fast, so I have to really watch it. It's not really going to hurt it if I leave it in there too long. It's just going to create a lot of fire scale, and I don't really want that in this case. Okay, so here's where I want that crease a little more pronounced. Okay, so now I've got that crease folded over with the hammer. Nice, I like that. So I've got one on each side. Now, I'm going to try to get it a little smoother, a little rounder, and then I'll address the corners of the vessel. So at this point, I just need to rotate and hammer. I can feel, as well as hear, when the steel is bottoming out per se, like it just did on the Swage Block. Then I know I've reached the bottom. I don't want to keep hitting in the same spot where I start to thin the steel out. I think I'm done with that for now. I'm going to move that so you can see the corners. I can start to round over like so in the round horn of the anvil. I think I'll take another heat on it first though. So I've gone as thick as 1/4-inch plate making vessels. I've seen people go much thicker. 12-inch for steel, or a little bigger. I actually like to do the thin ones a little bit more. The bigger ones take a lot longer to make, a lot more elbow grease, and they just get so darn heavy. They're hard to manipulate and move around. You really need, I find these days, a helper to help hold the steel on those larger forms. So I could shape the corner however I want. I actually just like the way it looks. They're gently rounded over. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I've got the basic shape. I need to give it a little more finesse now. So a little hammering on the inside, and then at some point I'm going to switch and actually work on the outside. So now I'm kind of at the black heat range, as Smith might say. It's too hot to hold, but it's, as you can see, definitely not red. I kind of like to do this in something like this, the fine tuning, because it's easier to see. It's just a little easier to hold and handle the steel. Just getting out a few bumps I didn't like. What I'm going to do is wipe this off and just see how it sits on the anvil. So it's sitting pretty good, actually. Good. So this is a very low carbon steel. The more carbon, the harder the steel potentially is. So if this was a higher carbon steel, there's no way I would try to hammer it at this low temperature. Now I bought this sheet steel, but one source I love to recycle that I learned from a smith is you can take oil drums, old oil drums, 55-gallon drums. They're the same very, very low carbon material because they'd rather have a drum crush than puncture. So it's a good source if you're doing this kind of thing to get to recycle and get that material. Anyway, so I've got the basic shape. I'm going to let it cool for a moment and then work on the outside. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to take this pipe that I briefly showed you. This is 1.5 inch standard Schedule 80 black pipe. That's something you could find at hardware store or any steel yard. What they would use for, say, a gas line or something like that. This common black pipe happens to be 1.5 inch. Now, I'm going to heat it up and forge it on end to create the foot shape. Now, while I'm waiting for that to heat up, this is now cool enough, because it's so thin, it cooled off that quickly, that I can take this over to this table, and we're going to show you a couple things, as well as do a little shaping. So I'm going to turn it upside down. I have this steak, mushroom steak. I'm going to turn the steel upside down and now work on the outside. So what I'm looking for, I like it to be somewhat smooth and round and symmetrical. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I do want to have a nice rounded surface where I'm going to attach the foot. Now the foot, that's steel, so I have some here to check. So that looks pretty good. There's just a couple little minor bumps I'd like to take out. And so I look carefully at the steel, and I'm also listening to the sound. So I don't overhammer the steel. Typically I rotate like this, very much like a jeweler would planish a bowl, for instance, if you are a jeweler or silversmith. I'm getting rid of a couple more of those bumps. It's also knocking off a little bit of the excess fire scale, which will make it easier for the next step in welding the foot on, a little bit easier. And that fits pretty good. Now, let's talk about the feet for a moment. So, the same pipe, what happens if you cut different lengths? So this is 2 inches of the same pipe forged on end, creates this kind of elephant foot, I'll call it. 1.5 inch kind of gave me an hourglass, which is not bad, but some got a little lopsided, a little crease there. So I actually found that the 1.25 inch length worked perfect for the shape I was going for. So that's what I used for this one. So the length of the pipe directly affects the shape that you're getting. If you go over the 2 inches or over twice the diameter, you start getting funny hourglass and peanut kind of looking shapes, for lack of a better term. Okay, it looks like a pretty good fit. What I'm looking for is that it's consistent all the way around where it meets the foot. It's not rocking a lot. So I think I've reached a good point where I can stop shaping this part. And now I'll make one of these feet. Let's see how that piece is doing that I put in the forge. Okay, so we're going to take that out. I might need to rotate. No, actually, it's good. Looks like a good orange color. I'm going to turn on my power hammer. Get that ready. Now, sometimes the pipe does split. This is not drawn over mandrel or seamless tubing. There's a little welded seam on the inside. But I find if it's fairly new pipe and you work it very hot, like I just did, at a good orange color, it usually holds up quite nicely. So you see it has a lot of fire scale on it, but it's shaped, give me a nice, I like that real subtle kind of just a nice simple hourglass shape, I'll call it. So I want to wait until that's not glowing red, and then I can quench it in water, and then I can move on to the next step. Just kind of fun how it looks with the way the fire scale, as it was being forged, that fire scale started to pop off, and then now it's not really red anymore, so now I can go ahead and quench it. And that fast, I've got my forged foot. So, because I'll take the one I forged, I'm going to dry it off a little bit, and I need to make it fit to get a little bit better fit on my vessel. I like it to take it over to a belt sander and do a little grinding. And I'll explain that as I get over that. That's over on this side of the studio. So I grabbed a rag just to dry it off a little bit. So it just turns out that this 2x72 inch sander works great for this kind of job. So first I have to decide which side do I want to be on the bottom and which side on the top, because it will vary a little. The dies on that power hammer are no longer perfectly flat, so that does sometimes, that's why I was rotating the steel frequently. So sometimes, quite often, you might get a slightly lopsided piece. So actually both sides are about the same. I'm going to call that the top and the other's the bottom. On the bottom, I'm just going to knock the sharp edges off. So we'll turn that on. Wouldn't want anybody to touch that and cut their fingers. Now on the other side, first knock the sharps off. What I've done is ground this on the edge of the wheel so I have a bevel all the way around. That way only the edge of the foot will meet the bottom of the vessel. You'll get a better fit that way. It just looks nicer. Then I check. If I need to, I'll make any corrections. You know, that's really not bad at all. I think I can leave that. What I'm noticing is a slight bump where my thumb is. So I probably should give it a little tap there, and then I'll move on to the assembly. Okay. So this will just take a moment. Back to my stake. Now, as I'm doing this stake, you may have noticed, or not, I don't know, I'll just mention, it's not a bought from a tool supplier. I believe it's some kind of axle or some kind of part from a train. I've often found that you can improvise stakes. So that's something to think about if you're setting up your own space. So next, I'm going to assemble this. To assemble it, I'm going to use a MIG welder. So I'm going to come over to the welding table over here. I'm going to stand on this side so you can see me a little better. This point, I don't need to glass this. I'm going to take a little bit of sandpaper. This is an electrical process. MIG welding, MIG. MIG stands for metal inert gas. It's a nickname, basically, or wire welding, it's often called. Being an electrical process, it's DC negative, but the main thing to remember is it's electrical. So the steel I'm welding, if it's not clean enough, it's not going to weld properly, or it may not weld at all. So the areas that I'm welding, see, a lot of the fire scale already popped off when I was correcting the shape on that stake. So all I have to do is lightly sand it, and that will give me a clean enough surface to get a good weld. The particular welding wire I use is somewhat forgiving, so that'll be plenty. And I cleaned the inside, so that should be plenty too. So now I just have to line it up nicely. And then this fire scale on the steel actually acts as insulation, but I don't have to sand the whole thing off. What I found is I can just kind of scratch it on the table, and that will give me enough of a contact, or what a welder would say a ground, to allow the weld to take place. I line it up how I like it. That looks pretty good. And now I'm going to have to put on some welding gear. Besides the sparks, the infrared light is really intense with the welder. And I don't know how many times I've, either been lazy or too hot and said, oh, this will only take a second, so I'm not going to put my gear on. And I've been sorry because you get flash burn. So just a quick moment, put my jacket on, proper gear, helmet. And I'll try to just put a few light welds. What a welder would call a tack weld to hold it together is all we need. So here we go. In this case, I'm just going to hold it together and then welding. Good, that fast, it's holding. Being that the metal is really thin, just turning off my helmet, you have to be careful, I have to be careful I don't overdo the welds, or they can burn holes through or cause little welding bumps on the inside. But mine came out nicely. I didn't overdo it. For once, I got it on the first shot. Good. I did practice a little before the demo. What I'm doing is, going to grab a wire brush here. It's the only thing I didn't put out on the table. And just brush it off a little. I'm going to show you the assembled piece. And then, so the only area that's hot now is the area I welded. This is just to remove some excess fire scale. And then I'll show you some that I've gone a step further and applied patina and sealer. Some people, you know, you can stop at any point you want, just like any art process. The maker can stop it when he or she decides a piece is done, it's done. So sometimes I just brush it like I am right now, and maybe I'll just put a little sealer on it. Okay, so I think you get the idea. So it sits flat on the table. The bottom, lose it. So, you know, you can do whatever you want with them. And I do make these in different shapes. I don't always start with the square. Sometimes it's a triangle, an octagon, whatever, you know. But square is just kind of a fun, simple one to do. It makes a great demo too. And so the reason I covered this, ta-da, my reveal, is that I didn't want sparks from welding to accidentally get on the finished pieces. So I have three. Each one has a slightly slightly different texture. This is much different texture than this one. And each one is a different color. Now to get these more vibrant colors, what I've done is I've sandblasted the steel completely clean. Often in auto body work, if you've done it, or just repainting a fence or anything like that, a good way to remove the rust or debris, fire scale in this case, is to sandblast it to get down to bare metal. And then I use a chemical patina. I just buy them pre-made. I don't want to deal with the hassle of dealing with chemicals. So you can buy them online. Just brush the chemical on, you get a chemical reaction, and then when it's dry, I put 3 coats of sealer on. I like the way that there's a variation. It's kind of variegated. There's highlights, there's dark spots. I can tell that's a recycled pipe because it has a nice rich texture on the inside. That used to be rust, so there's a brown one. A classic black. This was actually a patina I applied to get that very even black color, and then I steel wooled every square inch and then put, again, 3 coats of sealer. And then this one's green, and I like that it has that variegated brown look. So there you go, my steel vessels. They're awfully fun to make, fun to experiment with textures and different textures. I hope you enjoyed today's demo. And remember, you can leave comments if you like, and if you're interested in classes or workshops, I also do those as well in the studio. Thank you very much, and hope to see you at our next demo. Thank you.